Welcome to Tigray Media House. My name is Maliti Mestel. It has been more than 16 months since the war and siege and starvation, forced starvation on Tigray began, and it still continues. Human rights organizations continue to release reports on the brutality of this war. Today, we have a recognizable and significant guest with us, Getachew Reda. He is part of the TPLF Executive Committee, head of the Tigray External Affairs Office, and a member of the Government Central Command. Getachew, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So the crimes of this very brutal and dirty war have been very well documented by several human rights organizations, Doctors Without Borders, investigative journalists. 99% of these reports focus on the crimes that are being committed on Tigrayans, whether they're in Tigray or throughout the country. Recently, in the past week, Amnesty International released a report, and that report is called Ethiopia, Summary Killings, Rape, and Looting by Tigrayan Forces in Amhara. The report primarily focuses on allegations between August and September of 2021 in the areas of Kobo and Jana. The allegations are that family members of farmers were killed. As many as 30 women were raped, the youngest rape victim being 14 years old in the report. There's allegations of looting, vandalism. The report says that these things were done and that the perpetrators were saying things like this is revenge for what happened in Tigray. I know the government of Tigray released a 4-page report addressing the allegations. Amnesty says that you're not taking it seriously. Can you share your position on the report's findings, and does the government of Tigray take these allegations seriously?
Well, first and foremost, here in Tigray, we take such allegations seriously, not just as a matter of principle, but equally importantly, because we don't want whatever has happened to Tigrayans in the hands of the Eritrean regime, the Ethiopian government, and Amhara forces to happen to others. While we have been claiming for the last 16 months that we have been at the receiving end of such barbarism on the part of the Ethiopian government and its partners in crime, it would be absolutely irresponsible for us to not take such allegations seriously, because ultimately this will, in fact, this is part of the effort on the part of the Ethiopian government and its Amhara partners to create some kind of parity of guilt between the victim, the Tigrayans, and the villains who have perpetrated all the crimes against the people of Tigray. So we still want to maintain that Tigrayan forces will not be allowed to inflict the same kinds of injuries that they fought to neutralize in the first place. This is a general statement I can make. So because we take those allegations seriously, we know that Amnesty International has also been part of the campaign to expose the crimes of the Ethiopian government and its partners in crime. So we do not take their allegations lightly, simply because their reports seem to paint a less than reassuring story about Tigray. So we take those things seriously, because we also believe that Amnesty International would have the best of intentions when it comes up with such allegations. So on either of the two counts, we really take those allegations seriously.
There's a really tragic line in the report, and it says something along the lines of, we can't verify if the dead are civilians or fighters. And I thought that was really tragic. And in your response, you make a point that there's some contextual background that's missing. Not that you can ever contextualize rape of say, a 14-year-old child, but you do make a point about the incessant propaganda from Abiy and his supporters, pro-government supporters. You say that they've mobilized tens of thousands of really poorly trained and ill-equipped unarmed civilians. I want to just read two quotes that came from Abiy. One is, every Ethiopian must work closely with the security forces in being the eyes and ears of the country in order to track down and expose spies and agents of the terrorist TPLF. And we know that there are vigilante groups who are aiding the government, or who were aiding the government in interrogating and arresting Tigrayan civilians and putting them in internment camps around Addis Ababa and throughout the country. Another quote, now is the right time for all capable Ethiopians who are of age to join the defense forces, special forces, and militias to show your patriotism. That was an official statement from the government. And then, of course, following that, we see pictures of farmers and peasants, frankly, with machetes, not necessarily trained combatants. So can you talk about that? Talk about what you say is missing contextually from the report.
Look, the report clearly, well, the similar report was made probably about 2 months ago or something, 3 months ago, by Amnesty International, covering both China, Tigray and Kobo, in areas like Zogul and Gadamayu. What they have changed, what has changed since then, is that they have put some faces into their phone conversations and unnamed sources, to the extent that there are people who feel aggrieved or who could be victims of such violence. As we have clearly indicated, our heart goes out to them, because we don't want the same to victimize Amharas or Oromos, simply because our people have been victimized. That said, though, the quotes you have already mentioned clearly show that having lost almost all of the battles that Abiy was waging against our forces, it was an open declaration on his part and on the part of his government that people were being mobilized, civilians were being mobilized to serve as cannon fodders. In fact, their understanding of popular war was what is called human wave tactics, a la First World War. And human wave tactics didn't necessarily involve armed, ill-trained soldiers, but more importantly, priests and women who were barely dressed up for such engagements. Priests carrying tablets, making all kinds of noises, joined especially in China around Davat. This was what happened. And of course, when we talked about context, what we meant was our forces were, in fact, forced to rethink our engagement with the enemy, because as it turned out, we're not involved. We're not engaging an armed forces, because we had already neutralized most of the armed resistance, both the National Defense Forces in Amhara, Special Forces, and Fano militias. Then, as an approach, the Amhara government and Abiy's government clearly deployed totally unarmed civilians, and it took us a while to make a decision to withdraw from those areas. We're not pushed from Dawat. We're not pushed from China. In fact, we realized that most of the victims would be machete-carrying peasants, not armed civilians. So, in fact, the Central Command made a decision on the basis of the facts on the ground that continuing to engage such helpless and ill-trained people was the most irresponsible thing to do. So what Abiy has done is to blur the difference between combatants and civilians by, of course, mobilizing ill-equipped at best. Some of them are carrying guns, which would have been rendered obsolete in the 17th and 18th centuries, but they were carrying those guns anyway. They were no match for our forces. But obviously, the arrangement that Abiy opted for clearly helped blur the distinction between civilians and combatants. So I can tell you a number of civilians. Of course, the reports by Human Rights Watch and reports by Associated Press and Agence France-Presse clearly indicate that in many cases it was civilians carrying guns, so-called civilians carrying guns, who might have been killed throughout those engagements. But having said that, to the extent that there have been civilians who were caught in a crossfire or even targeted by our forces, we are more than willing to take such allegations seriously and lay those allegations to rest by getting to the bottom of things. Specifically in Zobel and Gadameyo, this is, in fact, to give you a context, what happened was government forces were far away from Kobo. Kobo is very close to Alamata, which is part of Tigray. And it was because our policy was for Amhara peasants and militias to keep their weapons as long as they kept them for self-defense purposes. Enemy tried to agitate people against our forces because they thought that with our forces advancing deeper into Amhara territory, some of our supply lines could be targeted by those militias whom we had decided not to disarm. So when we decided to disarm those who were being involved in the killing of an armed serviceman and targeting our supply lines, there was an open firefight. In fact, we have indicated in our reports, and it was also indicated by Human Rights Watch and other reports. Those so-called peasants were fighting our forces. And of course, we do not belong to the school of thought where our forces will turn the right cheek when our enemy target our left cheek. That's the kind of context that we have to take into account. And we were disarming armed Amhara militiamen. And of course, there was a very serious fighting in the town of Kobo. In fact, if it wasn't for the kind of meticulous planning and engagement our forces took it upon themselves, there would have been more carnage in Kobo because they were taking civilians as hostage, so as human shields. And but the story, of course, as always, is that once they are buried, armed people, and like you said, Amnesty International and other entities would allege that they couldn't distinguish whether the dead bodies are of civilians or. I mean, it's a travesty because you toss allegations and expect people to defend themselves, but you're not even serious about getting to the bottom of things. You simply say something that you know for a fact will cast aspersions on the integrity of the people you are accusing, and then advertently, consciously or inadvertently, you end up creating some sort of parity of guilt between governments who systematically targeted an entire population in what could constitute a textbook example of genocide, and people who did whatever they did to defend themselves against those the perpetrators of such genocidal campaign. So the point is, if these people are really serious about their allegations, and of course we believe we have reason to believe they are serious about their allegations, they have to allow themselves to be persuaded by reason rather than just tossing up allegations and just casting aspersions on the integrity of our forces. Having said that, though, we cannot say our forces are 100% free from any kind of involvement in such activities. To the extent that there is evidence that they have been involved in such activities. Of course, you cannot rule out the possibility of off-grid fighters getting involved in the vandalizing of property and other things. We are a responsible government and we take such allegations seriously. In fact, We have also taken similar measures against people who might have involved, our parts of our forces, members of our forces who have been involved in unacceptable conduct in more cases than one. But the most important issue for us is we are always open to conduct, to cooperate with an independent investigation to get to the bottom of things.
So you mentioned an independent investigation, and you also differentiate between systemic abuse and acts of violence. There was a joint investigation that was done that got a lot of criticism. There were high-profile Tigrayans who said that translators were intimidated, forced to resign. Most of the most egregious massacres were not even included, like Mahabere Dego, where pro-government forces actually filmed themselves committing really gruesome crimes. There was another report by Amnesty International on Tigray, and this was about sexual violence. And the title was, "I don't know if they realized I was a person." And in that report, Amnesty specifically says that there are reports of sexual violence as a strategy to terrorize and degrade and humiliate victims and their ethnic group. And they also said in that same report that the strategy is being tolerated by the highest levels of government in Ethiopia and also in Eritrea. Can you differentiate what's happening in terms of the allegations of abuse in the Amhara region, and the systemic abuse happening in Tigray in terms of murder, destruction of farmlands and factories, and so on?
In the first place, even one single abuse in Amhara by our forces is one too many. Let that sink in. I mean, we're not going to condone any kind of wrongdoing simply because it's authored by our people. That said, though, the distinction is clear. The reference to the higher officials in Eritrea and Ethiopia tolerating such abuse being used as weapons is an understatement. In fact, it's a gross misrepresentation of the reality. Higher up, Abiy Ahmed himself included, have been on record downplaying the use of rape in Tigray, as he was drawing parallel between what happened to members of the Northern Command, allegedly happened to the members of the Northern Command, and the rampant killing and raping of women in Tigray. Raping was an instrument of war, as far as Abiy and Isaias Afwerki are concerned. I'll give you a personal. This is one of the most the saddest moments. They were bragging that they have totally encircled us. It's around 17th of March, I guess. So it was a huge operation. Abiy was coming out in public and bragging about taking all of us prisoners, and we fought the Eritrean forces and the Ethiopian forces. And of course, it was one of the most defining moments in the history of our movement and struggle. By the time we destroyed the Eritrean army divisions around Workadino, I was crossing a river and I saw fresh dead bodies of Eritrean soldiers. And while one of the journalists was with me, was trying to search his pocket for some telltale signs of this and that, we found syringes and apparently there was a doctor who was part of our leadership. I asked him what that specific was, and I kind of thought it was diabetic or something that he was carrying syringes to, or worse still, I was expecting some kind of drugs, people who abuse substance and all that. But it turned out they were carrying what they call them. I call that, I don't know. It's like pregnancy, anti-pregnancy, whatever, suspension. So apparently, raping every one of them, all the dead ones, they are carrying medications related to, that have to do with pregnancy or terminating pregnancy and all those things. And obviously, these people had rape as part of their job description. The Eritreans, as far as we know, and the Ethiopian soldiers and the Amhara vigilante groups and militias and so-called special forces were on record bragging about defiling Tigrayan women. So this was not just being tolerated by the higher up. It was an instrument of war, which was consciously and premeditatedly imposed on Tigrayan women and Tigrayan children. Having said that, the systematic nature, even Amnesty International doesn't deny the fact that this was a systematic by nature, and of course, Eritreans have been accused of such a systematic abuse, such a systematic use of rape as a weapon of war. Like I said, our forces have never been accused of using rape as a weapon, to the extent that there have been cases, like I have been saying earlier on, will be doing everything to make sure that those allegations are properly investigated, and perpetrators of such crimes then have their days in court. If we take the safety and security of our people that seriously, there is no reason why we should go about compromising safety and security of the people of Amhara or the people of Afar, because we hold ourselves to a higher standard than our enemies, who have consistently been using rape as a weapon of war, and whose campaign clearly was systematic by nature, and no authority has come up with any argument to refute such allegations. In fact, the so-called joint investigation you alluded to was a sick joke. Not only did it fail to cover major crime scenes and sites throughout Tigray, but it was mostly about whitewashing the crimes of the Ethiopian government. In fact, to give you an example, there were efforts by the so-called Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to downplay what happened in Aksum, the massacre in Aksum, where hundreds of civilians were killed in broad daylight, and to blame it on the Eritreans, because it's always good to blame it on the party which obviously was invited by the Ethiopian government. They didn't come because they had clear casus belli, reason for war in Tigray. So the most important thing for us is not whether that investigation failed to dig evidence of systematic abuses in Tigray, because in the first place, the involvement of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission was not so much about discovering truth as whitewashing the crimes of the government.
Let me ask.
Go ahead.
You mentioned something that I want to circle back to, and you talked about the Northern Command and the alleged attack there. Can we just for 1 second address that? That is what Abiy Ahmed, that was the excuse he used for starting the war on Tigray. But what were the origins? We know that this started prior to that alleged attack. So what are the origins of this war? When did you know that Abiy Ahmed and his regime was going to target the Tigrayan community?
Well, Abiy had launched a massive propaganda campaign demonizing not just TPLF and the government of Tigray, but the people of Tigray immediately after he took power. In fact, this was a so systematic a campaign. Even before we left the coalition, the PRF coalition, we rejected his Prosperity Party. This was almost the one common agenda that ran through all our discussions, that the government media was targeting Tigrayans as the boogeyman that caused all kinds of travails to the people of Ethiopia. And so everything that had gone wrong the previous 27 years was being blamed on the people of Tigray. So that was part of the campaign. Of course, after we rejected the idea of joining the Prosperity Party, the campaign became even more vitriolic. So there was a ban on supplies to Tigray. Roads had been blocked for 3 years before actual hostilities broke out. Of course, Abiy, despite his protestations otherwise, he had been working with the Eritrean government. And Isaias Afwerki, who doesn't mince his words when it comes to revealing his intentions, was on record threatening to exact revenge on the TPLF leadership. And of course, for Isaias Afwerki, exacting revenge on the TPLF leadership was not about neutralizing the threat emanating from Getachew or Debrecen. It was mostly about cowing the people of Tigray into submission, because he thinks the people of Tigray and their representatives were the ones who stood in the way of his pharaonic ambitions in the region. That said, Abiy clearly was not going to settle for anything less than absolute submission of the people of Tigray. He ensured the submission of the Somali regional government. He ensured the submission of other regions. So the fact that the Tigray was not towing the official line simply meant he had to discipline us into submission. He said it in public. He threatened the use of force if we went ahead with elections. And of course, I mean, he must be the first so-called reform-minded leader in history to threaten the use of force against people who simply took their rights to vote, their democratic rights, seriously. And that's the strange. Not even the world did notice the kind of paradoxical trajectory Abiy's reform agenda was taking. So these traits we knew were premeditated, but the last straw came when Abiy mobilized the entire Ethiopian army towards Tigray. So by the time the so-called Northern Command incident happened, the entire Ethiopian forces were amassed around southern Tigray, in fact, in western Tigray. And we knew the officials, the officers, the higher officers in the Northern Command had received a contingency plan to attack Tigray Special Forces and to capture Tigrayan officials, myself included, of course. So the Northern Command people, there was no commander because the commander had already been removed because for Abiy, he was too lenient towards the Tigrayans. The commander who had previously served as the Northern Command commander, Getachew, had also been removed because he was apparently he was suspected of causing up to us, and that was not what Abiy would expect of his lieutenants. So the deputy commander included 2 of the deputy commanders of the Northern Command, and out of the 8 divisions, about 7 of them apparently were opposed to the unconstitutional move that Abiy was making. So whatever happened on the 4th of, I think it's the 3rd of November, I guess. Mm-hmm. The 4th of November was the work of the members of the Northern Command itself. Apparently, it was only 2 commanders, I think the 20th Division and the 5th Mechanized Division commanders, who were not particularly happy to protect us. Most of them didn't want to take part in the unconstitutional maneuvers by Abiy Ahmed. This is pretty much what happened. And to assume that the Tigrayan Special Forces would absolutely destroy a 30-something thousand strong and well-armed Northern Command within 45 minutes it would require a bit of a stretch to take such an allegation seriously.
You said 7 out of the 8 divisions of the Northern Command were opposed to what Abiy.
Six, yeah, 6, and 2 of the deputy commanders. But just to give you context, after 2 days, about 3 days, when they realized that the Eritreans were also involved, 2 of the mechanized division commanders bailed out on us, and of course they joined the Eritreans. They handed their tanks over to the Eritreans. That is just for the record. But the original plan by Abiy to take action against us was thwarted because most of the top brass in the Northern Command were opposed to his move. And of course, everything that transpired that night was the work of mostly the work of the Central. Once that happened, our forces began to take measures. Then of course, these measures went all the way through to the 10th of December, when our resistance faltered in the face of a massive Eritrean and Ethiopian and Amhara offensive. The rest, as I say, is history.
Well, you touched a little bit on the vilification of TPLF, and I want to talk about that in a second, because we are in Yekatit and people are celebrating. But I want to get to that in just a second. I just want to backtrack one more time to Abiy and the Ethiopian government are trying to sell this as an internal affair. And they're trying to say that it's just an internal disagreement that he's got under control. At the same time, he says that this is also an anti-colonial or anti-imperial sort of war, and that TPLF is a proxy for the West. We know that Eritrea has long been a mercenary country for foreign powers. But talk a little bit about, first of all, are you a proxy for the West? Talk about that a little bit. Yeah. Talk about the use of drones and who's involved and who's giving Tigray support, if anyone.
Nothing can be further from the allegation that we are a proxy to any power, West or East. Abiy is a textbook example of a leader who is ready to sell his services to the highest bidder, except that he doesn't necessarily settle for the highest bidder. He just sells his services for anyone who has the audacity to come and ask for it. Having said that, to hear Abiy and company waxing lyrical about anti-colonial anti-colonial background is excruciatingly funny. Abiy, I'll give you this specific example. Abiy, when he agreed to settle the Ethio-Eritrean dispute peacefully with Isaias Afwerki, the most ardent of Africanists would have thought settlement should come within the context of the AU, or at least, at the very least, within Africa. Not only was the AU excluded in the process because the agreement was signed in Jeddah and in Abu Dhabi. I have nothing against any agreement in Jeddah or Abu Dhabi, except that the then chairperson of the African Union, who had been invited by the Saudis to attend the signing ceremony, was then disinvited because Isaias Afwerki threatened to fail to show up for the signing ceremony unless that chairperson was disinvited. And nothing can be embarrassing if you are a genuine Africanist. I mean, to have to agree to the disinviting of an AU chairperson from attending the signing ceremony of 2 African countries, one of which hosts the African Union. If that is not abdication of African responsibility, nothing is. If that is not a willful humiliation of African ideals, nothing is. Coming back to what he is trying to do in Tigray, and the fact that he has invited the Eritreans to kill, well, quote unquote, his own people, the people of Tigray, at will, destroy property, vandalize property, took away everything they could lay their hands on, destroy factories, like nitpicking every valuable stuff, making sure that they could not be ever used again. Not just as factories, but also as what you call as spare parts, or as anyway, as any meaningful resource whatsoever. This was done systematically, and this was done both by Ethiopians, the Amhara included, the Amhara expansionist force included, and the Eritreans. I'll give you an example. Humara, they say, the Amhara expansionists say belongs to them, but factories in Humara were absolutely destroyed, because in the heart of their hearts, they know that this territory doesn't belong to them. The people do not belong to them. I mean, you keep trying to create an artificial reality on the ground, but the facts are stubborn. They have difficulty going away. So this whole joke about Abiy being colonialist and TPLF being a proxy for the Western, that's absolutely unacceptable. In fact, Abiy knows better, and I don't think not many Africans buy that story anyway. I'm trying to avoid expletives.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Thank you. So we know that drones have been introduced and used in a way that they've never been used before in Africa. We know these drones are coming from various countries, including China. Can you talk? The Chinese position is really, really perplexing. At least it is for me, because EPRDF gave China lots of access to Ethiopia and with various projects. And now, the Chinese have locked up the UN Security Council, for example, from being able to respond. And they say things like, well, the Chinese are impartial to internal affairs, and yet they're providing drones. So you can't be an impartial, but also part aggressor. So what do you think about the Chinese, and should other African nations be wary about Chinese involvement in their countries?
Honestly, I don't want to speculate much on what the intentions of the Chinese are. We know for a fact the Ethiopian government has purchased missiles from the Chinese. And of course, the drones, most of the drones that are being used, the Winglong 1 and probably the Winglong 2 belong to the Chinese. There is also a distinct possibility that these drones were provided by the Emirates, because the Emirates have also secured them from the Chinese. So it's a bit complicated, but the fact that the Chinese have always said no to any move by the United States government could be a culprit, could be part of the problem. Nobody knows why the Emirates are very much against Tigray. I mean, their drones are being used in the killing of children, in the killing of women. I don't think any meaningful political benefit can be made by weaponizing a reckless tyrant who has no clue how to hold a country together. To the extent that they have significant economic interest in Ethiopia, they should be part of ensuring the stability and the security of the country. What Abiy has done is what other enemies of Ethiopia have failed to achieve through decades, if not centuries, to ensure, to preside over the disintegration for the country. I mean, to the extent that there is a slim possibility of salvaging the Ethiopian state, I have difficulty seeing how, but it is going to be a very murky and complicated process. So the Emirates, the Turkish, in one way or another, have been involved in this. We know both the Emirates and the Turkish seem to realize that their involvement has not been the wisest of decisions as far as ensuring the stability and the security of the Ethiopian people is concerned. And my hope and expectation is that these people will come to their senses and see that working alongside with a tyrant who is busy destroying a nation is not the most strategic foreign policy decision they could possibly make.
Well, and he brags about the destruction. He brags about the destruction as well. Yeah. If you recall, he said that Mekelle is now equivalent to his hometown of Bashasha. In other words, it was destroyed, which is a tragic statement for a world leader. I want to ask you about, you mentioned a little bit about the vilification of TPLF. This month, we're celebrating Yekatit all over the world, marking, the start of the armed resistance and also the founding of TPLF 47 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about TPLF and EPRDF? I mean, you single-handedly lifted Ethiopia out of poverty, built schools, improved health conditions, and built universities and high-speed trains and industrial parks, and the dam that Ethiopia is now proud of, but gave you a hard time when you were in power. You're not given the credit, but you're saddled with the failures of the country. And let's be fair, there are plenty of things to criticize. But TPLF was vilified, and Abiy successfully sold you as the boogeyman of Ethiopia, as you said. Tell us about TPLF. Who is TPLF, the movement, and who is TPLF today?
Well, you see, let me start with it's a movement born out of resistance to oppression. People of Tigray have for centuries found themselves at the receiving end of aggression, authoritarian rule, feudal oppression, and all that. So when in 1975, few students from Addis Ababa University decided to take up arms against the regime, it was mainly about the right to self-determination, the right of the people of Tigray to self-determination, to secession. Of course, if it was possible for the Ethiopian state to be somehow reformed, where nations and nationalities of Ethiopia could live together on the basis of equality, then that would be icing on the cake. But if that proved impossible, Tigrayans came out by their thousands after the launch of the armed struggle in 1975 in support of the struggle for the right to self-determination after secession. The people of Tigray fought tyranny for 17 years, to the extent that other people were involved in this struggle. None of it would come anywhere close to the kind of exorbitant price Tigrayans have paid to ensure the downfall of the dictatorial regime in Addis Ababa in 1991. So TPLF essentially is a popular movement that simply extended Tigrayans' perennial struggle against oppression, but through a different form. Because Tigrayans, like I told you, have been fighting tyranny for hundreds of years. But most of the time, their resistance would be checkmated by organized rebels, would be checkmated by external aggressors, would be checkmated by even local feudal lords. What TPLF has managed to change since 1975 is to make sure that the struggle took the form of an organized resistance that would involve the breadth and width of the Tigrayan population. Of course, the 17 years armed struggle was an experiment with political military movement that involved the cross-section of the Tigrayan society almost without any exception whatsoever. So TPLF simply represented a popular movement that served as an extension of Tigray people's sometimes disorganized, sometimes scattered, sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful resistance against tyranny. And it marked a departure in the history of the people of Tigray, and of course, a departure in the history of the people of Ethiopia, in the sense that it showed how a population, no matter what its size, can beat the odds to overcome, challenge, and defeat highly armed autocrats who would brag about tapping into much larger resources than, say, Tigray. I mean, Mengistu Haile was bragging about representing a larger fraction of the population, and he was telling people that it would be quite embarrassing and shameful for them to lose in the hands of a very small fragment of the Ethiopian population, and of course, poverty-stricken at that. And of course, Mengistu Haile was bragging about impoverishing Tigray and blaming it on the people of Tigray at the same time. But no matter what allegations are, of course, these are the same allegations Abiy is making. Abiy should have made use of whatever resources EPRDF and TPLF had left at his disposal. Rather than doing so, he started demolishing everything the people of Tigray dearly paid for. Of course, the people of Ethiopia also paid dearly for. And Ethiopia, nobody mentions Ethiopia in relation to economic success. In fact, it's not even mentioned, it's hardly mentioned in relation to economic news. It's mostly mentioned for all the wrong reasons. It's mentioned when you deal with genocide, when they mention failed leadership and all that, okay? So TPLF is a popular movement that enlists the support of the cross-section of the Tigray population. And of course, once TPLF took power, both in Addis and in Tigray, it has undertaken massive development and reconstruction efforts. But the success we have achieved in economic and reconstruction areas are not necessarily matched by success in creating institutions, democratic institutions, state institutions, and all that. What we have achieved is a far cry from the kind of resilient institutions that history of Tigray would normally have entitled us to. Yes, we still have a long way to go. We still are fighting against all odds to ensure our survival as a nation. TPLF is still engaged in leading the people of Tigray in this resistance. TPLF will continue to take stock of whatever failures it has clearly. It has had its own fair share of successes, but it has also had it's more than its fair share of failures. So it will take stock of its failures. It will continue to work with the cross-section of the Tigray population, the Tigray people, to ensure the safety and security of our people, and ultimately to ensure the fullest possible exercise of our right to self-determination and secession. As a political party, TPLF has been in charge of the government of Tigray for the last 30 years. Like I said, we have had more than our fair share of successes and failures. And the TPLF has always learned from its mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes could cost us more than they should have if we did definitely attend to those challenges early enough. But we have a political process that has been perfected into an art form that simply means that you have to pick up where you've left off, learning from your past mistakes and trying to improve upon your performances. At this point in time, TPLF is not just a government that deals with reconstruction or anything. It's more importantly, it's a government that is involved in ensuring the survival of the people of Tigray as a people. We are fighting against. So it has to make sure that the whole cross-section of the Tigray population, the entire population of Tigray, whatever political persuasions they come from, whatever political background they come from, whether they are in the opposition, whether they are in the diaspora or here at home, should play their part in this campaign against genocide, this campaign for survival. So if TPLF's task right now is whether it will step up to the plate and make sure that all Tigrayans continue to rally behind this cause, and we come out victoriously in this struggle against tyranny, in this struggle against genocidal campaign.
I have a question from an organization in the diaspora, but first I just have one quick question about your time in EPRDF. So there's a lot of confusion, and I feel like it's intentional about what multinational federalism is. And so there's an effort by Abiy and pro-government supporters to describe it as an apartheid government system or a tribalist system or politicizing ethnicity. I understand multinational federalism as being an answer to all of those things, or at least it was an attempt to answer those issues, a way to prevent erasure and forced assimilation on very distinct people who share a country. Can you share just briefly your thoughts on that? And then I'm going to ask you a question from a group in the diaspora.
Okay, look, the multinational federalism in Ethiopia was simply a response to our realization that Ethiopia, as it had always existed, was not tenable anymore. I mean, like, there was no point in pursuing this Ethiopia, glorious Ethiopia kind of mantra, unless it takes necessary steps to accommodate the diversity of its people. Diversity, demographic diversity is one thing. The ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and all that. You know, those people, Abiy included, who would have you believe that multinational federalism is ethnicization of politics or a formula for disintegration, are simply fugitives from the complex reality that Ethiopia is characterized with. I think it was, I don't exactly remember. I remember an article by a guy who has studied Ethiopian history. And he said, diversity is a lived fact, but a denied reality in Ethiopia. Most everybody would have you believe that Ethiopia has about 80-something nationalities. But when it comes to accommodating those nationalities, both culturally, linguistically, and religiously, governments would often go a wall. I mean, you cannot deny this reality and expect work. So Ethiopia's vulnerability, for the most part, emanated from the fact that its failure to accommodate diversity simply meant it could not effectively address poverty, which was probably one of the most perennial challenge of the Ethiopian state and the Ethiopian people throughout history. So it was essentially in response to such realities that multinational federalism, people speaking their language, what's wrong with that? Oromos going to hospitals and seeking the advice of Oromo speaking doctor. Why would that constitute a crime? Tigrayans going to courts and not being forced to say something which would be lost in translation simply because they are not allowed to speak their own language. What's wrong with that? I mean, what's wrong with Tigrayans speaking their language? What's wrong with Tigrayans administering their own affairs? Canadians, French-speaking Canadians, have their own government. I mean, it could be a bit of a stretch to take such an example from North America, but it's not. It's not, because it's a fact, and people naturally gravitate towards a system that somehow recognize their right to speak their own language, to develop their own culture. And this is pretty much what happened, okay? The Oromos, Abiy was an Oromo politician, part of the EPRDF, and no Tigrayan has ever administered the Oromia region. The Oromia regional state was administered by Oromos. To the extent that there was plundering of public resources in Oromia, it was done by Oromo officials, left and right. Whether there was some Tigrayan or Amhara crook who was working with them doesn't change the fact that they are the ones who are responsible for their own regions. Tigray was being administered by Tigrayan. To the extent that Tigray has failed to achieve the kind of impressive result it should have and could have achieved, it has only TPLF or the Tigray leadership to blame, not the Oromos, not the Amharas. So these are the kinds of things that, in fact, with all the minuses, during the 27 years of EPRF leadership, Ethiopia has achieved an impressive success, not just infrastructurally, not just economically, but also even politically. The fact that especially Abiy came to power has nothing to do with his claims to be the most reform-minded leader in Africa. No, he tapped into the frustrations of the youth in Oromia, that they were not beneficiaries. They didn't receive the amount of benefits the multinational federal system should have or would have brought to them, simply because of lack of good governance, simply because of lack of access to public amenities. So it was not about doing away with the multinational federalism. The Oromo youth fought against my leadership, not because they were against multinational federalism. They fought against our leadership simply because they thought that the kind of social justice, economic justice, that was changing the lives of millions of Ethiopians did not accrue to them. And this is a very valid demand, legitimate demand. Whether Abiy was far better placed to respond to that demand, history has proven. No, I mean, it's not even 2-3 years have clearly proved it otherwise. But the most important thing for us is especially those who hearken to a non-existing glorious past, would have you believe that if we were to speak Amharic and if we were to sing the same Orthodox hymn, then Ethiopia would somehow miraculously have achieved the status of a great state or a great nation or something like that. That is simply a fiction.
Thank you.
Ethnic background, ethnic diversity is a reality, and you have to take the bull by the horn. You have to accommodate it. You don't have to shy away from it.
I could keep you here for hours, and I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm gonna ask just a couple more questions. So thank you for being so generous with your time. I want to talk about one of what I think was a failure of TPLF when you had a bigger stage. Was the lack of communication and access, I think, to the people. And what you have done is, be it through your tweets or through social media or other platforms, is you have made the government far more accessible than it has ever been before. And so by doing that, you've been able to bridge a divide between generations of Tigrayans, particularly because Tigrayans are the ones who are under attack right now. And for one, I would just want to ask you, did you ever expect such a rally from young people in the diaspora, Tigrayans who, many of whom have never been to Tigray before, even, second-born generations outside of the country? And then I have a question from two incredible sisters, the Gabramanhin sisters, Hausen and Ma'bel, who started Tigray Action Committee. And they wanted to say that they have been advocating nonstop to lift the siege on Tigray and to free their families who are trapped there and who they haven't been able to access or reach. And what they want to know is, what more can the diaspora do? Are they being effective in their push and support for peace talks?
Yeah, first, the communication thing, like you said, has been a very serious challenge. People often ask us why we didn't explain what happened in Maikadra. Maikadra was a systematic genocidal campaign, ethnic cleansing campaign by the Amhara vigilante groups. But because they had full control of the media, they have robbed us of any use of the media and communications. They managed to create what could be considered an artificial reality on the ground. And the fact that with what little opportunities we had, we're trying to reach out to the world. pales in comparison to what the marvels of Tigray have achieved. It was, in fact, especially after March or something, because we were able to pass through parts of Amhara region, partly for survival. But once we dealt with the Eritrean forces there, we knew we had turned things around for the better. And of course, it was barely 2 months after that engagement that we liberated most of Tigray. And it was then I realized that the kind of movement that was set in motion by, like I told you, the marvels of Tigray, has changed Tigray and forever. Well, I don't think the Americans, they've been very, very instrumental in raising awareness, of course, in calling for responsibility and accountability. We are grateful to that. And the rest of the world has been contributing its share. But I would say none of these efforts would come anywhere close to the kind of concerted effort made by Tigrayans in the diaspora. And we're extremely proud of that performance. And of course, my piece of advice is for you to stick to what you have been doing, because it has proved its mettle. If it wasn't for your efforts, it would have been almost impossible to locate Tigray on the map. On the I think on the 10th of December, it was clear that there was little in the way of hope for our resistance. But every village you go, that hardy peasant would tell you, would overcome it. Not in a matter of years, but a matter of months. They wouldn't even tell you, okay, it's not going to take 6 months. They would tell you, it's not just about pulling your legs, or it's not about making you feel good about yourself. It's just plain certainty on their part, and they would tell you, we want to prevail, and in a few months' time, and prevail we did. And that same spirit, hardy peasant in Tigray has pretty much is shared by people walking in the streets of Los Angeles or Washington DC, in London, and elsewhere in the world. So it's I don't know how to describe it, but what you have achieved is nothing short of miracle. It's quite monumental, and it's will be part of the glorious history of Tigray and the people of Tigray. There are things we know you've been doing superbly. Build on those things, and of course, the need to organize, because what TPLF has taught the people of Tigray, if anything, the most successful achievement of TPLF is that it has brought to the fore the need for organization, the need for an organized movement, an organized resistance. There could be some wheezy kids here and there who could come up with all kinds of creative ways to bring pressure to bear on tyrants and genocidal regimes. There could be all kinds of media use that would help highlight the suffering of the people of Tigray. Those individual efforts will remain as individual efforts. Yes, there could be significant achievements here and there, but the most successful campaigns are the ones who are done in an organized manner. So if we can develop your activism into a movement where beautiful ideas can immediately be transmitted to the rest of the world like a brush fire, that will have achieved a significant result. Of course, Tigray would stand to benefit more if all your participation in the diaspora is done in an organized fashion. So you have this Tigray, Free Tigray, Omnat Tigray, whatever Tigray, though you have to come together and organize your efforts, because I know the thinking cannot necessarily be done collectively, but once the thinking develops, once the thinking is made, you can further develop your actions and your moves, and also better organize your resources, and it will have maximum impact. So to give you specific ideas of how you should do your business would be quite an insult to your intelligence. You've done marvelous job doing so, but for me, the only piece of advice I would give you is a lesson that I think every like-minded people throughout the world should take from what TPLF achieved in Tigray. If anything, what TPLF achieved is the fact that a people, no matter how large their population, can achieve extremely incredible results, beating all odds, as long as they organize themselves superbly. So organize yourselves, and
what I like to say is
together.
In Abi's effort to destroy Weyane, he actually woke a sleeping giant. You brought all of Tigray's children back home, and it's been marvelous to watch and see how that's unfolded. I have just two more questions for you, because I know you have to go. It's late where you are. How do you interpret the recent developments with the various religious institutions? You have the Tigrayan Orthodox Church, you have the Tigrayan Evangelical Church, you have the Islamic Affairs Council, all announcing that they're breaking away from their Ethiopian counterparts. As you know, heritage sites have been looted. More than 300 priests were killed. Nuns have been raped. These ancient artifacts and books are now showing up on sites like eBay. What do you say about this wholesale destruction of Tigrayan history and, frankly, human history? And also, what do you make of the separation of these religious institutions? As you know, Tigrayans are very pious people and they follow their religious leaders. So what does this mean?
Well, look, what was done to Tigray by the so-called religious leaders in Addis Ababa pales in comparison to what has been done for Tigray by even well-intentioned priests amongst themselves. What we know is institutionally, the Orthodox Church has failed Tigray. And by extension, they have failed its own Orthodox population, and by extension, Tigray, the population of Tigray. Fortunately for the Catholics, they don't answer to the Catholic Church in Addis Ababa. They have their own direct relationship with the Vatican, as I came to learn very recently. So what I would say is, in light of what some of the US-based bishops of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church were trying to say, when it's an abomination when a religious leader, someone who is often referred to as Bisu Abatachin, His Grace or something, goes to American officials to plead with them not to push the Ethiopian government to negotiate with, as they say, the terrorist organization. And they were defending a government that has committed genocide. And they have lived most of their lives in the United States of America. So they have the same robes that pious religious leaders have in Tigray. It would be absolutely irresponsible for them to continue to consider themselves part of such an abomination. And I'm not surprised that they went ahead with whatever they decided. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it's long overdue. It's not for us to decide. It's the religious institutions themselves who have come up with such a decision. I personally would think that this is a decision in the right direction. And of course, it's long overdue. When the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and its Holy Synod, so-called Holy Synod, tries to stifle its own patriarch simply because of his ethnic background. I didn't make this up. It's an open secret. When you have members of the Ethiopian Orthodox Holy Synod calling for the extermination of the people of Tigray in public. Forget not saying anything about the artifacts being stolen, plundered, being pillaged, being vandalized, and all that. What we are witnessing is a religious institution that's up to its neck, complicit with the very crimes the regime in Addis Ababa and the Eritrean regime have committed. So it's long overdue, but it simply means Tigrayans are finally taking their fate into their own hands. In their own hands. That's all I can say at this point.
Wow.
What was the second question?
I want to ask you about what you think that means for Tigray, and I'll just transition this into my last question for you for this interview anyway. And I look forward to more conversations in the future. But what is the resolution to all of this? Is Ethiopia a failed state? Can it recover? Is there room for reconciliation? I mean, what does it look like moving forward? Because as you said when you opened this up, it's really the farmers and the peasants and everyday people who are being killed and slaughtered and are being used in this war. So what is the resolution to all of this? And do the church separations relate or indicate what is to come for Tigray?
Well, I would say, the most ideal solution would have been a peaceful one. I mean, we have always been for peaceful solution. War has been imposed on Tigray. It's not something we chose. There is a frustration on the part of, much as I try to imagine a scenario where the Ethiopian state could be salvaged, I have difficulty finding an answer. But having said that, though, whatever Tigray chooses to do, in terms of whether it becomes independent or part of Ethiopia, is something that needs to be done in a manner that befits the aspirations of the people of Tigray. Well, if statehood simply is about creating a youth population that stampedes to leave the country, our northern neighbors spring to mind, their experience and all that, I don't think it would be a disservice to the people of Tigray if a statehood is about creating a scenario where your youth will have to stampede to leave the country, fought by their feet. The people of Tigray deserve a Tigray with institutions that, to all intents and purposes, are on par with the most advanced states. Whether that can be done within the context of a larger Ethiopia, no matter how it could be salvaged, that's a different story, is an entirely different matter. As far as I'm concerned, and for now, our focus should be making sure that Tigray, recognition or no recognition, operates as though it was an independent state. So it will have institutions, including its army, including other institutions that other advanced societies have. And let's focus on making sure that those institutions are there. Like I said, the religious institutions have taken it upon themselves to lead the way. I think it's a move in the right direction. We'll continue to engage with Ethiopians of all political persuasion, whether we have to share similar views about the fate of Ethiopia is an entirely different matter now. We cannot physically dislocate Tigray from Amhara or Afar. So we have to find a way to live together with the people of Afar and with the people of Amhara. So what sort of arrangement it might take, I don't want to speculate. But as far as I can see, there is a growing tendency on the part of the people of Tigray to part ways with the past. Whether this decision to part ways the past would translate into independence, let's cross the bridge when it comes to it.
Wow. Thank you.
I would have ruled that out.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. We learned a lot in this interview, and I look forward to more conversation in the future. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I look forward to more conversations too. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.
All right.